video, I'm going to be discussing the topic behind mentalism, which is also known as discovering what is the voice. Now you might say, what is the voice? Well, let's get to that part. When you look at a particular being, such as a human, we have two experiences to our life. We have a physical experience, a body, a voice, but we also have an internal world, a mind, where you can think to yourself. What is that voice? Well, let's find out. In the idea of mentalism, we have to understand the subjects regarding how magnetism works, which is the principle of how mentalism works. And in understanding the concept behind magnetism, you realize that there is an opposite pole for currents or bonds to occur. And once a bond is created, you can't break it, essentially. But now let's get to the portion of things that are basically in the idea of mentalism is the idea that you can infer or tell somebody's internal state, which this is the theory of the mind. Can you tell that person's internal state? But if you could, now you enter the realm of being diagnosed to something known as what is known as schizophrenia. Because when you enter this particular diagnosis of hearing, that's when you need to find who your true self is. Now, let's imagine the opposite poles of magnetism, which allow energy to kind of have a flow to it, a current. This is a principle of electricity. If you wish to have a current come from here and go to here, you need to allow that current to have a direct line. And in order for that direct line to be made, you need to have it essentially isolated or insulated. Now let's dive into the human body, for example, and let's analyze chakras, which chakras are an ancient belief system. They're what is known as the energetic lungs. And just as you can breathe with your lungs, these energetic lungs have a pole. A pole bounce, and this energy flow has to come from somewhere. Because if you want the opposite pole to send that energy, There has to be a direct line. And that means now you're introducing the idea of connecting with a creator of sorts. And in the idea of connecting with a creator, if you can get to this point, you can now understand that the mind can achieve anything. But now let's analyze the source for a second. The creator. When you get to the creator, the source of this energy for magnetism should be essentially isolated and insulated, resulting in life. And now when you get to this portion, you might have some fears or anxieties in yourself at this very particular moment. Because what I'm essentially claiming is that the Word became flesh. Is that the mind became a body. And that you are in the Creator's image. Now let's dive into the idea of mentalism now that we understand these opposite poles of energy, if you wish. In the idea that you can infer a person's internal state, it means you can tell what's inside them. Let's dive into the internal self, for example. And let's find out who that is right now. At the beginning of the universe, of the Big Bang, light exploded, but ultimately it was the sound waves that allowed the light to use the sound waves as energy, like a treadmill or a track, if you wish. It would speed up the process for light to travel. But now as the light travels with sound, what is the first thing you hear upon life? Sound. You encounter sound before you encounter light as a newborn. And if you don't believe me, what is the first thing you did when you were born? Typically you would cry. Or at least your mother would cry. And that would essentially wake you to life. From the screaming, the crying, sound. Almost as if there is a resonant pitch attached for the moment of the first breath to induce. But now let's dive into the birth of that child, for example. Because you see, in the idea of mentalism, which is a concept that Nikola Tesla understood quite well, in The idea of mentalism is the idea that you can technically take energy from here and put it here without having to use a line. But now let's imagine back to the source. And now let's put the other point here. And you can put that energy at a different point. And now when you look at that energy, it has a voice, a body, and it has an internal self with that same voice. So let's find out how we can actually achieve this state where we can actually expose the voice. In the idea of the mind, you have to understand the things that stimulate it, and the things that stimulate the mind are essentially drugs. The forbidden fruit. And in the forbidden fruit takes form in, once again, polar opposites, because there's polar opposites of people. Just as there is polar opposites of minds. And now when you look at, say, an introverted and extroverted person, you will see how they use according to what makes them their opposite. As if a extroverted person, you could say, is a root chakra dominant person. And now when you look at an introverted person, they are a psychic chakra rooted person. And these opposite poles, which are of the same thing, which is you, notice a reference to the cross here. These opposite poles, which are you. 1, 2 of 1. Let's think back to that Big Bang for example. We're now, as the sound wave travels through the universe from its initial point, the source, and the light expands. But now let's imagine the light more as energy, because that's what the sound wave is carrying. But the speed of light is slightly just greater than the speed of sound. And now this light is traveling through the universe. And it arrives here on Earth. And now you see that this opposite pole has arrived from its source. You have arrived here. But in these 1 and 2 of 1, you are not just the light, the life, because that is only half of your experience. You have 2 experiences to make 1. You are the light, the flesh, and you are also the sound, the word. And the word became flesh essentially when you became aware that your mind affects the world around you. You've become resonant, you could say. And this resonance is just like a musical instrument, because that is the purpose of how energy travels from point A to point B without using a line. It does so by using sound or frequency to allow a resonant tone to travel through space-time to the direct point you are sending it to. And the source point sending it to you, which then absorbs through your chakras and creates the evolution of your body beyond the moment of conception. Now you begin to see that this portion of finding your voice, because ultimately the only way, if we were to now go back to the initial concept of mentalism, which is the initial diagnosis of what is known as schizophrenia. And the idea of mentalism is the idea of understanding the mind. But now you've understood how the mind works, which is through a process of mentalism, also known as magnetism. And it emits through an electromagnetic field created by the heart. And this electromagnetic field traveled throughout all space. Which means now when I think of someone, I immediately send that thought to them. And when they think of me, they immediately send that thought back to me. The question now is, how can you tell it's real? Or how can you tell it's not real? Well, that is the beauty of the mind, is in the mind you can create. There's a void, a black hole, if you wish. And you exist on the outside of this black hole, known as the pupil of your eye. And in this black hole, intakes information and then dematerializes it, or materializes information, also known as matter, outwards from an isolated portion. The current itself is isolated. But the moment you give it a voice, when God simply just goes, simply you could say, strikes a note, a frequency that then has a direct opposite pole. And once you get to this level of stealth, you realize that the reason people with schizophrenia develop a messiah complex is because they begin to believe that they are of a messiah personality, that they have a great power. Unfortunately, it's not that you have a great power, it's that everyone has this great power, it's no one is aware of it. Until now. You've just used your ears for the first time. Welcome back.